Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this pre-conference webinar on community-based disaster preparedness for complex and new emergencies. This has been organized as a part of the forthcoming and the very prestigious World Congress on Disaster Management, which is going to be held from the 24th to the 27th November 2021 in New Delhi. Just wanted to set the context for this webinar very briefly. So I wish to bring the attention of this very distinguished audience to the contemporary frame in which we are placed. Over the past couple of decades, humanitarian emergencies have become more complex, longer lasting, and harder to address. We are increasingly facing compounding and interrelated environmental, socio-economic, and political crises, which are even tending to erode the civil, political, and economic stability of societies, particularly when they are exacerbated by natural hazards and diseases. However, most of the times, approaches to these problems remain stereotypical, fragmented, and inadequate. The most recent and unprecedented COVID pandemic, for instance, has entailed a protracted crisis with waves of infections spread over several months. Apart from the most severe health impact and heavy mortality, the pandemic has also brought in its wake a number of other threats to human life, well-being, and livelihoods. In the overall context, the newer disasters are tending to lead to manifold socio, psychological, economic, and environmental shocks and disruptions, leading to increased risks and vulnerabilities. COVID has also clearly brought home the fact that social and economic disparities do lead to differential impacts on distinct categories of people, and the manner in which they expose the deeply embedded structural inequalities and vulnerabilities of people across the spatial context. The growing frequency and intensity of such complex and compound events, the persisting vulnerabilities of masses of people, and the associated strain on existing disaster response capabilities of governments and civil society has brought to core the need to expeditiously assess the present disaster preparedness capacities and usher in quick action that entails cooperation, collaboration, and the deployment of creative approaches for the ongoing, emerging, and future compound risk scenarios. Community-based disaster preparedness, we all know these have always been underscored as very critical elements of vulnerability reduction and disaster management strategies. They become all the more imperative in the context of the newer and complex contingencies. They are, of course, premised on a policy trend that values the knowledge and capacities of local people and builds on local resources, including social capital. CBDB is instrumental not only in designing local coping and adaptation strategies, but also in situating them within the wider developmental planning and discourse. Of course, local people can be relied upon to resist unsustainable and vulnerability increasing forms of development and livelihood practices, as also raise local concerns more effectively. Undisputedly, while disasters affect the entire community, their impact on impoverished persons, persons with disability, women, children, older persons, pregnant and lactating women, they need special focus and attention. Equity and inclusion of marginalized sections of society by bringing them to the center stage of planning and implementation have to be prioritized to make disaster preparedness participatory and inclusive. It is in this context that the need for this webinar on community-based disaster preparedness for complex and new emergencies was felt. This webinar has been organized by the All India Disaster Mitigation Institute and the University of Delhi under the World Congress of Disaster Management. The key questions that this webinar proposes to address include why and how this loss of community has taken place, why community-based approach must be relocated, in the mainstream, especially in the context of these newer emergencies, and how and who should take these steps. In the overall context, the webinar will focus on the need to reconfigure communities in mainstream community-based disaster preparedness. I know that it is very, very difficult, and whatever introduction I give, of my very esteemed panel members will not do justice to their stature, to their work, to their expertise, and the distinction that they have earned over the numerous years, of the work that they have undertaken. Yet I shall try. To begin with, our keynote speaker, and he doesn't need any introduction, Dr. Krishna Vatsa. He has worked in the area of disaster risk reduction and recovery since 1995. Prior to joining as member NDMA, Dr. Vatsa worked as policy advisor, Disaster Recovery Bureau for Policy and Program Support, UNDP in New York and Nairobi. He also served as the Regional Disaster Reduction Advisor, South and Southwest Asia in New Delhi. He joined UNDP in 2007 as Early Recovery Coordinator in the Philippines. In his career as a civil servant, Dr. Vatsa joined the Maharashtra Emergency Earthquake Rehabilitation Program in the state of Maharashtra, India in 1995, and implemented a large-scale earthquake recovery program during the next 4 years. He also served as secretary to the government of Maharashtra Relief and Rehabilitation, and then as Secretary Rural Development and Panchayati Raj. In the course of his career, he has extensively consulted for several national and international organizations in the area of disaster risk reduction and recovery. He has a Doctor of Science in Disaster Risk Management from George Washington University and has published extensively on the subject. Our second panelist is Sri Amod Mani Dikshit. He has a Doctor of Engineering from Ehime University, Japan. He completed an MS in Mineral Exploration from St. Petersburg University, Russia, another MS in Engineering Geology from AIT Bangkok, and was trained in non-profit leadership in the Graduate School of Business, Stanford. His 47-year-long professional service comprised of overlapping 2-decade stints with the government of Nepal, 10 years as a director in a private engineering consultancy, and 25 years of full-time executive directorship of NSET, a civil society organization which he founded in 1994. At present, he is the president of this organization. Dr. Dikshit has taught engineering, geology, and disaster risk management, and is a visiting faculty in many universities. I have a huge list of universities where he is associated with. He has worked in Nepal and many Asian countries for disaster risk reduction and earthquake response. He also serves as the advisory board member of Institute of Hazard Risk and Resilience, Durham University, UK, and chairs the Asian Disaster Reduction and Response network of 50 civil society organizations. Under his leadership, NSET received the Sasakawa Award, UNISDR, in 2004. He has published more than 100 scientific reports, book chapters, and papers. Our third esteemed panelist, he may be number 2 in the order, is of course Mr. Timothy Wilcox. He is the Program Management Officer, Asia and Pacific, UNDRR Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific, a former head of office for UNDRR's Sub-Regional Office for the Pacific in Fiji for 5 years. Mr. Wilcox is now based in Bangkok and manages UNDRR activities in Southeast Asia. He also leads the UNDRR private sector resilience activities in Asia and Sendai framework monitoring in the region. Prior to the UN, he served in the Australian government for 13 long years, monitoring Australian aid program activities in humanitarian disaster risk management, regional pandemic, and health programs in both Asia and Pacific region. No stranger to disasters, which he was just mentioning in the morning. He served for 7 years in the emergency services in Australia and holds a master's in disaster management from Florida International University. Our fourth distinguished panelist is Professor Vishal Nath Upreti. He is an academician of merit. He has been as an academician at the Nepal Academy of Science and Technology and has been the former head of Central Department of Geology and Department of Geology. He has also been the former Dean of Institute of Science and Technology, Tribhuvan University. Professor Upreti has also served as the president of Nepal Geologic Society and the chairperson of Disaster Preparedness Network, Nepal. He is currently the president of Nepal Center for Disaster Management. He has been awarded with national and international honors, including the Mahendra Vidya Bhushan Medal and the prestigious C.N.R. Rao Prize for Scientific Research from the World Academy of Sciences. Professor Upreti's main research areas are structural geology and tectonics, engineering geology, paleoseismology, geohazards, and disaster management. Our next esteemed panelist is Mr. Aslam Parvez. He is the Deputy Executive Director of Asian Disaster Preparedness Center. He has substantive fieldwork experience from more than 15 countries in the Asia-Pacific region and Africa, with national and subnational work in program development and implementation in emergency preparedness planning, post-disaster damage and loss assessment, recovery planning, private sector resilience, training and capacity building framework, and curriculum development. He has been involved in various global and regional initiatives on disaster resilience, business continuity planning, and digital resilience. Among other notable initiatives, he mentors the ADPC Private Sector Engagement I Prepare Business Facility and Post-Disaster Needs Assessment Initiative, Ready for Recovery. And last but not the least, our esteemed panelist, my co-organizer of this webinar and the moderator for the session is Mr. Mihir Bhatt. Mr. Mihir Bhatt leads the All India Disaster Mitigation Institute, which is working on disaster, climate, and conflict risks at the community level through agenda shaping, co-creating knowledge, building capacity, and piloting at district and city level. Mihir Bhai has been involved for the past 3 decades in addressing humanitarian system reviews, global to national, at many locations, including India, Nepal, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka, across many sectors such as food, livelihood, and early warning systems, and addressing a wide range of crises from heat waves to cascading risks to collocation of risk. I think it is calculation of risk. He was among the first in 1995 to develop community-based disaster preparedness course with Asian Disaster Preparedness Center and Duryog Nivaran. And since then, he has developed over 28 thematic courses and has conducted over 12,000 CBDP cycles in communities across India and the Asia Pacific. His current work focuses on green relief, community asylum, social protection by communities, and disaster relief insurance. Thank you for listening to the introduction of our esteemed panelists. And now I hand over the session proceedings to Mihir Bhai. Thank you.
Thank you, and namaste, salam to everybody. I hope my voice is clear.
Yes, it is.
So I'm very glad to get this very important topic for us, but also for the World Congress get going. And it is not a new topic in any stretch of imagination, but it's also not a topic that we can leave behind. It is very current and it is very forward-looking as well, because the way things are changing on the community front, on preparedness front, on the risk front, and this topic again becomes very central. So, and we can't have a better panel than this, which has very direct, hands-on, local experience, national experience, expertise in the wide range of sectors, all the way from human development to tectonics, and also people who have worked on the UN side, government side, with local organizations, networks across Asia Pacific. So I'm very glad that we'll have a very interesting discussion, very informative. If you have any questions, you can put it on the chat box and we'll pick it up from there. And we will start with first Krishnaji, if I can request you to get this whole topic going. And please draw from your experience of course as the National Disaster Management Authority active and eminent member, but also the work that you have done since the earthquake. So thank you very much, and the floor is yours, Krishna.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Professor Agnimitra. Thank you to Meherji for inviting me to this webinar, very relevant discussion. And it's a pleasure and honor to share such a distinguished panel. In course of my intervention here, I will provide a little perspective on how the community-based disaster management has evolved over the years. What are the emerging challenges and how disaster management system needs to respond to those challenges. We are meeting in the context of COVID-19, and COVID-19 has brought out a very complex nature of risks. And it's very important, it needs to be underlined. Risks are coming together. What we call, sometimes it's a difficult word, concatenation of risks, where we are looking at a very high level of mortality, livelihood losses, the loss of income, employment, and people are facing a loss of basic entitlements, which are reflected in food shortages and things like that. As we deal with the COVID-19, we are also very, very mindful of the challenges posed by climate change and how climate change is also contributing to the complexity of risks, how it's also bringing different hazards together. And risks are becoming increasingly strange and unpredictable. I mean, to give you just one instance, which is very recent, we had the cyclone Gulab arising in Bay of Bengal, and then it made a landfall on the eastern coast, and then it traveled all the way over land, and then it emerged into the Arabian Sea as Cyclone Shaheen. It has happened for the first time that a cyclone that has emerged in the Bay of Bengal has traveled over land and then again, emerged as another cyclone in the Arabian Sea, and it has traveled all the way to Pakistan and the Middle East countries. So it was something very, very unthinkable, perhaps a few years ago. But this is what is happening. Last 3 years, we are seeing that the cyclones are striking the eastern coast and western coast almost at the same time. And it poses a huge challenge before the disaster management system. And what is happening is that cyclones also bring excessive rainfall, and this results into flooding. Flooding also brings landslides in the wake. So we find that we have cyclones, storm surge, strong winds, flooding, and landslides happening almost simultaneously. And the community is getting affected in one way or the other by an increasing combination or a cascading combination of different kinds of hazards. And people are affected in several ways. Of course, the disruption of services, livelihood losses, and shelter losses. So the losses are also becoming very, very, I would say, dispersed, but very extensive. So here, what is happening is that dealing with so many disasters, we need a system upgrade. Right now we are perhaps equipped to deal with one disaster or the other at one time. But when so many disasters come together, we definitely need to augment our resources. And we need to diversify our capacities. We cannot just focus on response and preparedness. We also need to pay equal attention to recovery and reconstruction, mitigation. So a system upgrade in terms of our capacity to deal with multiple functions of disaster management is fast emerging as a critical priority for us. Now, how do we deal with the communities which are bearing the brunt? Communities, of course, have dealt with disasters for a long time, and it has undergone some change. And I would like to go over some of these evolution in course of my interventions. The first, that when we were a colony, or say the major part of the world was the colony, it was in colonial, under colonial rule, we had a lot of agrarian crises, we had a lot of droughts and famines, and people faced severe food shortages and hunger and starvation and deaths. At that time, the communities always, they lived together. They had some reciprocal arrangements. There was a strong social network based on caste, religion, social identities. And there existed a reciprocal arrangement within the community. And they tried to deal with some of these situations through exchanges, social exchanges. The food would be exchanged, the seeds would be exchanged. So these are some of the these were some of the arrangements that existed, and we have enough anthropological literature available which indicates the social arrangements in place for dealing with large scale disasters. Of course, as the intensity of droughts and famines increased, some of these arrangements broke down, and people were not able to cope with that. And it also led to large scale deaths. In South Asia, of course, we had large scale deaths whenever droughts and famines happened, and because, despite all the arrangements that existed within the society, the scale of drought was very, very heavy. When the countries became decolonized, and we had governments, national governments taking over the reins, then the governments started dealing with the situation, and the governments started funding large scale public works. They also provided some subsidy, food subsidy, and the communities participated in some of these programs and tried to cope with the situation. So 1950s, 60s, 70s, the governments would provide famine relief or the drought relief. They would organize, works through which the cash assistance would be given, food assistance would be given. And that's how the communities survived. It definitely brought a change in the patterns of community coping. Communities were better able to respond to the disasters. But still, it was subsistence. It was mere coping. It was, the communities were just able to keep their body and soul together. It was definitely not a situation where they could break free of the structural poverty and the utter deprivation that they lived in. 1990s, I think there was definitely a change in the paradigm. That was the decade of the IDNDR, disaster management was just emerging as a discipline. And that was the time when there was a focus on community-based disaster management program. How the communities need to come together, organize themselves, understand the nature of hazards and respond to disasters better. So we had different kinds of models for the community-based disaster management. We had a volunteer-based model, and cyclone preparedness program of Bangladesh is a very, very good example of volunteer-based programs. Then we started working with the communities on preparedness, how they will evacuate themselves, how they will provide first aid, how they will alert the other members of the community. And this also helped the communities in dealing with some of the sudden onset disasters. There was also a greater focus on community participation in recovery and reconstruction and mitigation. So there was definitely a paradigm that emphasized community participation, but it left one big equation unattended: how the community should access resources. There was no way it was again a kind of a paternal relationship. International agencies, international NGOs, and to some extent governments would come and support these programs. But how the communities would become independent, or communities would access resources, communities would become more self-reliant, that was not really a great success story. So in terms of channeling the resources, it has its serious limitations. But it definitely demonstrated a viable model of communities' engagement with disasters. And when this deficiency was clear, then around the beginning of this century, we had the cash-based models. All the international discourse was focused on how to accelerate the cash-based assistance, cash transfer, cash. And they thought that people should be given access to resources. And once they get these kind of assistance, they would have more choice. Cash is more fungible. They can use it to multiple use as per their own perception of priorities. It would not make them very dependent. So everyone, international agencies, NGOs, governments, they started emphasizing cash-based assistance. It definitely helped the communities. There was less transaction, there was less corruption, people got the assistance. But again, the limitation of this model was that the cash assistance was always insufficient. Whatever was provided would help them cope, but would not help them build their livelihoods, and it provided some assistance, but it did not again bring them out of a structural poverty. So we still continue with the cash-based assistance, but we realize that it has now serious limitations. So now the situation that exists today in the wake of the COVID-19 and climate change impact is that we need very different kinds of assistance to come together. We need to provide assistance for building and rebuilding livelihoods and assets. So we need to go back to the basics. What is it that would reduce the vulnerability? The basics are that we need to focus on assets and livelihoods. And all the earlier paradigm of assistance would not address some of these issues in a very fundamental way. And if we really need to reduce vulnerability, and if we really need to make communities resilient, then we need to focus on the assets and livelihoods. And therefore, we need to develop a kind of assistance models which really help people build assets and livelihoods. So what it requires that we continue with cash assistance, but we also bring in many other things, credit, cheap credit or concessional credit. We also need to think of some, cheaper insurance. We need to also encourage people contributing their own resources. We need to provide technical skills. We need to have people rebuilding their houses. We need to promote financial inclusion. And most important, we need to promote digital literacy. All these things have become very, very important. And if you just do one or two things, it really doesn't make a difference. It leaves people, it gives them temporary respite, but it leaves people where they are. What the recent crises have also brought out very clearly that social protection is very, very important, very critical. And, if you look at the COVID-19 experience of the developed countries, you would see that their social protection arrangements served them very well. And so one of the indicators of the development is the feasibility and adequacy of social protection arrangements. However developed we are, we need to have social protection mechanisms. And these social protection mechanisms must be efficient, must be more transparent, more inclusive. They should focus on food security, subsistence employment, cash support, and all those things. In India, a number of things were done. The people got assistance, cash assistance into their accounts. The food was distributed. All this thing definitely made a huge difference to the way people cope with the COVID-19. And I think these social protection arrangements need to be strengthened further. Now, all this requires that we, within the system, disaster management system, all the important functions, preparedness, response, mitigation, recovery and reconstruction, they are more well-balanced, they are more developed, because, if you just focus on response, which we have been doing, then, it does not do justice to the community. If we just focus on recovery and reconstruction, which happens after a larger scale disaster, such as one that happened in Nepal recently, what happens that, okay, you have done a good job, but then there are smaller disasters and you don't have the resources to support people for their recovery. So what is needed is that there is a sustainable financial arrangement for all kinds of disaster management functions. They need to be institutionalized. I think recently the 15th Finance Commission has recommended 4 financial windows for different kinds of disaster management system. I think it is an excellent beginning. We need to strengthen it further. So what is important is that we should have differentiated financial assistance or differential financial support for different kinds of disaster management functions, so that the communities communities can access resources and communities can really rebuild their resilience. But all this also requires that disaster management system of a country needs to be strengthened. These functions, these financial windows cannot be sustained unless we have a real systemic strengthening of the disaster management system. So if you want a very viable community based disaster management system, it needs to be supported through policies, financial institutions, and the financial systems and the government institutions. And only then you can find that there are some the other agencies, other organizations sitting outside willing to support, but there is not enough catalytic beginning.
Yeah.
So if you start doing this, operating these institutions, you will find that many more actors coming together and making a real long-term, more sustainable difference to the way community disaster management system can function. So this is all that I would like to say on the basis of my experiences, my understanding of the situation, and I would be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Krishnaji. It was a very extensive and comprehensive overview of both historic across time and across locations, especially across various events, how things have actually developed for community-based approaches. May I request Timothy Wilcox from UNDRR, who's in charge of most active region, both in terms of facing disasters, but also coming up with community-based approaches, a wide range of them. And, please, Tim, it's yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Mahir. What I'll do is I'll just share my my screen. I've got a brief presentation just to go with what I'm talking about. So I'll just share this, and let me just activate it. Okay, can I just confirm you can see my slides?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so so I'm going to do my best to answer the key questions to this webinar, which is basically why and how the loss of community has taken place in terms of disaster management, and why community-based approaches must be relocated in mainstreaming disaster management, as well as like who should take these steps in the overall context of things. So what I'm going to do is I'll do my best to answer, and I'll use my slides here to help. So first of all, there's an old saying, let me just get that out of the way. There's an old saying in disaster management, which is that all disasters are local, right? Now, what does this really try to say? What it's actually saying is essentially is that the impact of a disaster is really at the local level. Okay, so people talk about national disasters, but really a national disaster is really just a bunch of many local disasters across the nation, right? But the response to a disaster is at the local level, and thus the preparedness and the resilience needs to be at the local level as well. Okay, and if you speak to any survivor of a disaster, most will tell you that it was a neighbor or someone nearby, or that lived nearby, or something that helped or tried to help them in the very first instance. And in these pictures, you can clearly see from real life disasters, like the two gentlemen here are helping an elderly lady cross the flooded water. They're not from the military, right? They're not from the police force. It's possible that the government's on their way. The person here using the chainsaw has a chainsaw next door and is helping their neighbor, right? So when we think about disasters, we're always thinking about the government coming in and helping, when the reality is the first people on the scene are probably a neighbor, right? Okay, so, there's always going to be a need, right, for the government to help. But for the most part, the response is usually at the local level. Okay, and now we're beginning to see people, instead of helping themselves or helping their neighbors, what they're doing is they're actually kind of waiting for help to come to them, right? Again, there's always going to be a need for that, but in many instances, people used to be able to respond or help prepare or help build the resilience of their community, but now they're kind of waiting for to be told what to do. Okay, and the increased number of disasters is highlighting the need for this greater localization of managing the disasters and their risks, with the need for stronger community-based disaster management. So that's where things were, and that's where things are kind of heading. So why and how has this loss of community focus kind of taken place? Well, essentially, to be quite frank, it's been argued that disaster management and disaster response, we've kind of done our jobs a little too well over the years. Okay, so we've essentially raised the expectations of a community and inadvertently disempowered our communities in some ways from their own resilience. In many ways, people now expect the government to do almost everything for them in some ways. I don't need insurance because the government will help me rebuild. I don't need to prepare as much because the government will respond and help me. And a good example of this is actually from a story that was told to me by the Deputy Prime Minister of Tonga, which is an island in the Pacific, where he said that he was. People had been essentially told to relocate and to evacuation centres in the country in anticipation of a very bad cyclone coming through. And he was driving down the road, and there was a family sitting on the side of the road with their belongings. And he stopped and he said to them, "What are you doing?" And they said, "Well, we're waiting for the government to send a truck to take us to the evacuation centre." And he said, "There's no truck. Please just start walking to the evacuation centre now." And then they said, "Well, we don't have any food to take with us." And they said, "Well, there's a banana tree right next to you. Why don't you take some of those bananas and take them with you to the evacuation center?" Now, it's a very simplistic story, but essentially what it's trying to say is that in many ways, there's this expectation that the government does things for us now, right? Whereas before, he was saying, the Deputy Prime Minister, is that if you went back in time, then in many ways, if you told people to go to evacuation center, they would just simply go. Right, they wouldn't have this expectation that someone take them or someone feed them and things like that. So it's a very simplistic story, but it's just trying to show the story and tell the example of like how we've raised expectations of what is done for people, and in many ways we've kind of disempowered our communities in some ways. Another reason is that in many times the local disaster planning is done in consultation with locals, right? Because we tell people you have to consult with the locals, don't just simply do the planning. But in many ways, the locals may not have an active role in the implementation or the exercising of the plan itself, right? So in other words, the local government may develop a plan in consultation with the locals, the different sectors, but then in the execution of that plan, the locals may not actually have a role in that, right? So there's a plan, but in some ways we've kind of again disempowered the local community because they don't have an active role in the execution and implementation of that plan. Another reason is that in many instances there's no longer really incentives to invest in mitigation and prevention as well. I mean, there was a country here in the region, for example, where essentially the national government was responsible for paying for all the response and the recovery bills after a disaster. So in many ways, the local government had no real incentive for investing in mitigation and prevention activities, because if something happened, the national government would simply pay for everything, right? So again, this is how kind of things have kind of changed over the decades. So how do we shift back to this local model? Well, really, I mean, people talk about a bottom-up approach where it's like, the local government leads the prevention, mitigation and response, and the national government kind of helps out. Well, we really need to kind of, preach, not just preach that, but actually live it as well. This bottom-up approach, and drive the demand from the bottom up, right? Not top down. We need to empower our local communities more by involving them actively in the implementation and not just in the planning stage. But also to help do that, we need to resource local community groups, NGOs, churches, and faith-based organizations that are actually in the community itself, right? Who take a lead role in the prevention, the preparedness, and the response and the recovery after disaster. We need to have a whole of society approach is needed. In many instances, we see people doing local DRM planning, right? And they do consult with certain population groups, but they may not consult with all the relevant population groups, right? So they may talk to the women and the children, but they may not talk to persons with a disability, or they may not involve the private sector, or they may not involve the religious organizations. Okay, so we really need to take a genuine whole society approach, particularly at the community level, and tailor it for those communities, right? Because in some communities, they may have a larger proportion of a particular group than others. Like there may be more migrants who don't speak the local language as much in one particular community. We need to incentivize individuals and communities to invest in mitigation and resilience, right? So, offer a discount for insurances, okay, the policies, encourage people to do that. If actually fund mitigation activities at the community level, actually say, here is money if you want to do a mitigation project. Okay, and you'll see that many local governments will actually put their hand up and say, yes, we will do that. Again, we need to adopt an all hazards approach, not just the traditional hazards. So this is important. It's popped up recently with COVID-19. One good example is one of our fellow UN agencies did a study in the Philippines amongst small, medium enterprises. And it actually showed that 50% of the small businesses that had business continuity plans found that those plans actually were useless to respond to COVID-19 because the planning had only examined traditional hazards, right? The things that people know happen all the time: flooding, fire, typhoons, earthquakes, etc., right? But they hadn't taken into account non-traditional hazards or emerging hazards, right? Like pandemics, okay, emerging infectious diseases, lockdowns, and things like that, or cybersecurity issues. And so, if we have this all hazards approach to our planning, then we can have more effective, plans that are more responsive to what's happening to what around us in our society, particularly with the increasing effects of climate change, right? Another one is making data on hazard risk available and understandable to the community. So this is actually quite important. And a good example of this is actually from Brisbane in Australia, where Brisbane City Council is a city, right? A very large city in Australia. And essentially they have a website where if you have a property in Brisbane, or if, let's say, for example, you wish to purchase a property in Brisbane, you simply go to this website, you enter the address of the property that you wish to purchase, right? And it tells you what the flood risk is of that property. So you're making an informed choice. The picture here, for example, says that there is a risk of flooding because the highest elevation is 8 meters, and the flooding has gone above 8.3 meters. So there's some risk there. So people can actually make an informed choice of what they're purchasing and where they live and what can things be done. Now, this is easily understood. It's easily publicly accessible. And this type of information can really empower local communities to actually understand what is the risks to their community, where they live. What do we need to actually plan for? What do we actually need to prepare for? Okay. And because the truth is, you can't prepare for something you don't know about, right? And if we're looking at traditional hazards and things, well, we need. So we all know there's data out there, and that's why it's really important that it's accessible to the communities to empower them to actually do something with that information. So before I finish, just some quick action points here. Again, there will always be a need for government assistance, all right? It's just a fact of life. There will always be a cyclone Nargis. There will always be an Indian Ocean tsunami, okay? A mega disaster of some kind that overwhelms the communities and their resources, okay? But we really do need to empower our local communities to prevent, mitigate, prepare, respond, to recover from hazards and disasters, okay? Because that's where it starts and that's where it ends, okay? The community are the first ones there, and they're gonna still be the ones who are there afterwards, after the recovery efforts have been done, okay? Right, and to help them do that, we need to help give them access to data, right? Disaster and hazard data, very important, and they have to be able to understand it. And this helps local communities to understand their risk. If they understand their risk, then they can better prepare for it, okay? We need to have an all hazards approach, not just the most frequent things that we know about, okay? But also we need to encourage proven traditional knowledge to prevent and mitigate. Okay, in many instances in many parts of the world, there is a lot of really good traditional knowledge that helps local communities understand when a hazard is about to happen. Okay, when a cyclone is approaching, or an earthquake or a tsunami is approaching. Okay, and we really need to encourage that where we can. But more importantly, we need to incentivize local communities to actually, prevent and mitigate and prepare and respond. In many ways, they're not necessarily so much incentivized. Again, they're kind of waiting. And this is not a phenomena that is unique to developing countries. If you go to highly developed countries like the USA, there is this high level of expectation that the government's going to show up immediately, right? And do everything. And it's just not true. So to help do this, we need to give active roles, implementation and evaluation, not just consultation in disaster planning. Like, have to give them a role. We have to increase their ownership at the local level and help empower them and say, okay, this is your community, these are your risks, and this is how you can help prevent, mitigate, and prepare and respond and recover to these things. Okay, and here's a plan, and here's the role. Give the local Red Cross community, give the local churches, the local NGOs, an active role in these things, and exercise them on a regular basis. And I think then we'll actually begin to see more resilient communities overall, and there's this lowering of expectations, I think, and kind of take community resilience back to the communities themselves, where it belongs, where it starts and where it ends. So I think that's all I've got. So thanks very much. Just a quick presentation there for you, and I'm happy to take questions afterwards. Thanks, Professor.
Thank you so much. Parth, I was wondering if there are any questions that have come up from the participants that you have access to, because we are continuing and with the presentation. The next one we have is Amit and Dixit. Parth, I was wondering if you have been able to spot any questions in this that you have. Okay. We will get the section. So, Amod Bhai, can you hear us clearly or not?
I'm hearing a lot of noise there in the background. I don't know.
Yes, there is a lot of noise in the background.
So I will mute myself at least to start with, and Saksham, if you could kindly see that Amod Bhai has clear sound.
Okay, so Mir Bhai ji, thank you very much for getting me into this panel, and I really am enjoying it. I like very much the action point that team has talked about, and all the history and social protection that our respected Basji has talked about. These are my some of the action points that Tim said. I'm going to take them along with me in my life. So, your three questions. Paraphrased, why CBDRM has become weak and how to make it strong again. CBDRM is to be relocated into the mainstream. Perhaps the question is related with linking it with the development, and how and who should take the steps. It's very difficult to answer this question. With my more than 45 years of experience, I don't see that it is going to be an ideal situation. It will happen just in a just society with 100% of equality and equality of opportunity and access, which is difficult to imagine. When I was looking into Professor Neera Agnimitra asked me, I was looking into and musing over what is happening. So I somewhere found out these three conditions for the society to have this, this bringing back the community action or empowering them. Basically, how the society is structured socially and economically. The poverty and inequality, so long as the inequality persists in the society, it will be very difficult to bring back or to incentivize or empower the community. The way society and state interact, again, the people and the state and their relationship through the national government or others, and the stability of the political institution, the political economy of the situation, and the exercise of power. That is where it is it is disturbing the community, even diminishing the power of the community, and the internal relationship between the decision makers. Silo effect, we have seen all that, one department doesn't talk with the other department, one university doesn't talk with the other university. Even within the university, the research are not very, widely shared or talked about. This is something I stole from one of the publications of IFRC. Nonetheless, the picture is not gloomy, and there are secondary preventions possible, and we should try for that. We should plan for the preparedness for managing consequences of complex and new emergencies. We should, there are all possibility of decreasing the risk of epidemics, especially the vaccine preventable ones. And prioritize the adaptive health infrastructure. We have seen that in COVID, we perhaps at the beginning, we were just hands up and we thought that we couldn't do much. Later on, we ourselves did that. No external agent could go to the community. And community, very quickly, they reacted and started, with the volunteers and others, they made it themselves with the support from the national government. We talked about localization of everything, preparedness, reconstruction, or even response and others. It is a necessity, and the more localization taking place, the community become more empowered. We have seen that in COVID-19, and we have seen that how they didn't know about all these things, but they could learn, and they could learn the isolation center. They could learn the isolation and tracing of the migrant with infected, with COVID. Well, I come from NSET, and this is the map that NSET flashes very much. And the areas which are shaded like this, they are where community-based programs are running throughout the country. This is the whole map of Nepal, and you see that even in the remotest area, this shading is there. So 6 rural municipalities, 34 municipalities, and many places, community-based disaster risk management program are running. And there are these risk perception surveys or awareness program and hazard mapping and community-based hazard mapping and planning, awareness and pilot demonstration, and also, the women, becoming the champions for disaster risk management at the community level. These are all sort of a traditional programs that we have been doing, and many people do that. Awareness, posters, pamphlets, community-based, all of the planning and others. We did it also in the earthquake reconstruction. The earthquake reconstruction actually was divided conceptually into 3 parts. It was the raising awareness, the capacity building in terms of human resources, as well as the institutional capacity building, and then the institutional improvement. But the raising awareness, it involved a lot of talking with the house owner, with the local leaders, with the municipal staff, the elected members, the community groups, and they were involved in this orientation and mobile earthquake clinic or information hub and desk, and explaining the publication. This we learned from our own work for the last 20 years almost, for building code implementation in municipalities, but also the school program. But largely, the first kick I got, it was from from Chamoli, from Gujarat, from Kashmir earthquake in Pakistan, from Bam in Iran, and from Banda Aceh. I see the importance of that. But still, well, in case of the Nepal earthquake, what we did was, we were given the responsibility for helping reconstruct 50,000 households in 4 districts. We went to every doorstep of the 50,000 household. We learned it from Patanka in Patan district of Gujarat, where we, together with Seeds, with Manu Gupta, we went to 300 households there. And here it is almost 50,000 households. And we mobilized, a team of 3 people. One is the actual engineer, the other one is the social mobilizer, and the third one is the mason, trained mason. We brought this, technology, materials, and construction process and knowledge about that. We explained the government's reconstruction goals and processes to the people or the homeowners, and then we helped them build confidence for reconstruction, and we were at their disposal for during the entire reconstruction period, and they would come to us. And we would share the stories about reconstruction in other countries, for example, in Gujarat and others. So all these things we did. And one more slide, then I will be more critical. This slide is prepared by a team from ERI, the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute, that came to us. And it shows the response to Gorkha earthquake in terms of search and rescue operation. And it shows the rescued and recovered victims. What we see is that the total victims are, say, about 9,000 people. 9,000 people were recovered dead, and many more, 25 or 26,000 people, 22,000 people were recovered alive. And those who were recovered, we had more than 50 international teams, the search and rescue team. They could recover 19 live people. Our national military and police and armed police force and Red Cross, and they recovered about 4,000 people alive and something 2,000 dead. But the community and self, just now Timothy also talked about that. The community, they recovered 17,000 or 18,000 almost, live people. Compare these figures. So this is the power of the community, and it is they really can do, but we have to have the trust. So after this, I will go to talking about. Let me do. Why I'm not? It is not moving. Okay. So let us come back. What is CBDRM? Why CBDRM is becoming weak? There is a prototype of thing. We do awareness, we do poster printing, we go there, and we in a limited period of time, we want to do all the training, the piloting and everything, and then we come back. Very quickly, everything is forgotten, and it starts collecting dust because low integration in the system and the memory. There is no integration in the system and memory, and it was talked about by Timothy also. What we saw that is unique, it requires a long-term engagement for sustainability. But the most important thing is that, most people, they stop at awareness, they stop at training, they stop at conviction, they stop at this thing. Risk reduction actually is not done. And without the risk reduction, it is not possible to institutionalize in their memory. For example, in landslide hazard, which we did after the earthquake and also before that, and we are continuing doing that together with Durham University. We are looking into different epochs of landslide and how the dynamics of landslide it's coming very strange. But then we we give them many knowledge, awareness with posters, but come monsoon, landslide occurs. They tell me, okay, very good, you teach us about landslide and all these things, but can we stop the landslide? Help me stop the landslide. Unless you help me stop the landslide, I cannot convince others, and after some time it will be forgotten. So in community CBDRM, all the efforts should be taken all the way to risk reduction, and it has to be explained. And while explaining, don't make Timothy talk about over raising expectation. Don't raise that we can do everything. Help them understand the landslide process, why it goes down, and what could be the possible intervention options, and what are their limitations. Some of the landslides just cannot be stopped, but we continue telling them, about, all the hazard mapping and all these things, and we don't tell them that we cannot do anything. So limitations also should be done. What can be done and what cannot be done should be told and shared with them, and they should realize. And then, if you can, not only if you can, but then help stop the landslide if it is possible, and explain how it is stopped. If it cannot stop, then tell them and find collectively another alternative. This is what we see, is that unless you do the risk reduction to the ultimate stage, all this CBDRM is going to, it's going after some time. And that's what the reason of the erosion is, that risk reduction is the key and long-term engagement is needed. And how do you do the long-term engagement? You talked about the how and how question. I see here the local government to be the key, and the local government who does the development programs. It could be a ward level, it could be a municipal level. They, development programs to include DRR and CRR preparedness there, an efficient emergency response system. But then it should be with the involvement of the community. The more chances of the community involvement, the more lower down in the hierarchy, government hierarchy you go to the ward level, and then there will be mixing with the community. What we see is that our academia is totally detached from the community. And in our engineering institute, they take up, all the surveys and all the surveys, or all the problem solving, or all the, the risk assessment or vulnerability assessment. They do it on a theoretical basis, but they have no link with the municipality or others. So what we see, I was in China. I was a professor in Wi-Fi, PIFI professor, PIFI, the same, in the Institute of Mountain Hazards and Environment. And while working there, what we see is that the institute, it's a research institute with PhD students there. They have every link with the local municipality, and this continuously solve the problem of the local municipality. That wonderful relationship of academic institution with the municipality and with the local people, they have a frame of agreement for research and technical assistance to the people. If there landslide or there soil instability or erosion, or even or agricultural problems and other problems, and local community and their aspirations and efforts and failures and successes, these are the objects of the research, of the field work of the students for the academic institution. And in that area, they send their students for exercising in survey or others, and by doing that, they create actual maps for the local municipality. So such type of engagement, if it is there, the CBDRM can actually come out very quickly. People talk about community capacity. We did a calculation about what actually we need at the local level for emergency response to tackle the multi-hazard situation, or encouraging the people all the time. So we looked into, say, for geologic hazards, we looked into, and what we see is that in Latin America, they have got one squad for every 10,000 volunteers, 10,000 population. And one squad, it is something like the community emergency response team. What we see is that about two, one squad means day and night, means for taking turns, about 6 people per team. So say 15 people per 15 volunteers for 10,000 population. And that means that 10% should be instructors, so that the number of volunteers is continuous over time. And they should be given equipment.
Amonji, we can't hear you.
Them.
Now
Hello?
we can. Yeah, now we can.
Can we? Yeah, there are some this thing. So what we see is that for doing all these things, and for reviving or putting them into the higher visibility and engaging them more, there should be the local government, and the local government should be creating engineers to serve in the United States or in Europe and solving the problem of 60-story multi-story building. And they don't teach the stone masonry building that were damaged and that killed people, 80,000 people in Pakistan, or 13,000 people in Gujarat, or 9,000 people in Nepal. They don't teach these things. These needs to be reversed, and solving the academia, solving the people, the problem of the people, that will revive the CBDRM, and that will open up all the might of the community. But there are problems. We can talk a lot, but there are something we cannot do. This is the Melamchi disaster of 15 June this year. And this, absolutely a flourishing township has already been devastated with more than 10 meters of, the flood. Still, we have to understand our own nature. We have to understand our own hazards. And unfortunately, not very far from Kathmandu, this hazard was not understood. Although the nature was actually, it was very open, and now one flight reveals that the hazard should have been expected. So there are still some problems. We also are failing, and we have to accept that our academia or our professional, we also need to correct ourselves, and then we can make community-based this thing into holding. So I think that I should stop here. I just have in a very high relief in our profile, from Himalayas to the plains, and these are the realities. The hazards are there. We cannot get rid of them, but then the community should be empowered, and they have to face these hazards in future. And it's not possible to control all the hazards, but to understand them already makes us very strong in terms of how to deal with them. So at this moment I stop. I don't know whether I could answer the question that Mir Bhai raised in terms of this thing. So thank you very much. I stop here.
Thank you, Amol Bhai. You did address the questions head on, and then gave reasons behind your views or observations that you have, and we'll come back to you in the questions that I can't see, but Dakshan can see, and he will be feeding that to us. Can we request Vishal Nantiupreti, please, for your presentation?
Mir Bhai, I see a lot of noise. I hear a lot of noise in the system.
Yeah.
Is it only me or others also? Okay, okay, we know where it comes from.
So I need sharing. Where I have the sharing given to me? Yeah, okay, all right, yes. And then I go here, full screen. Then I go here, display setting. Okay, I hope you get the full screen. Yeah?
Yes, we did.
Okay, all right, yeah. So, well, I'm just trying to focus more on Nepal this time so that, you can compare and you can see the problems that we face in Nepal. So I would focus more on Nepal rather than more on general aspects of CBDM, okay? So, yeah. And, when we talk about Nepal, it's so much contrast to India that, you have hardly about, 1 or 2% of the Himalayan region, and rest is your all flat areas. Now here, almost every inch of the country is on disaster list, whether you are in the high mountain or in the plains, where, you have the floods and a lot of other disasters occur. And of course, every inch of the country is prone to earthquakes. And as you have already, we have already those earthquakes of 2015, and similarly 1988, 1980. So we have a series of earthquakes that are occurring, and we are also expecting big earthquakes in the future. So this is just, this year, and also at the same time we live in Asia, and you can see Asia is something, the world map, 50% or more than 50% of all hazards and all disasters occur. And these, you can see these yellow things. This is just, the recent 2020 World Disaster Report that you can see. Therefore, I just mentioned, Nepal is a hotspot of natural disasters. We live with disasters, actually. And it's becoming more and more severe as we go by. And climate change is another factor that has come up. And just now, Amodji showed this picture, and this is in June. Even we didn't have the monsoon start. And you can see such a big thing, disaster. And in terms of monetary loss, in terms of lives, and not only that, we have a very big project that just lying few kilometers, tens of kilometers upstream, the lifeline for Kathmandu Valley for water, water supply, and that is damaged. And we are now waiting to restart that project. It was completely damaged, So, Nepal that way. And at the same time, you see here that we have a lot of these, you just name anything except tsunami. And sometimes I say, oh, don't worry, there is also tsunami in Nepal, and that is coming from the sky. So this clough is a tsunami from the sky. It comes from high mountain, 5,000 meters, 6,000 meters high, and comes down. So you can see every disaster that you think of, we have. And now, just at the beginning, I will not be talking much about this pandemic here. I will just avoid it. That's a special issue. And, we have already 1 million people, almost 1 million people got infected, and almost 12,000 people or 11,500 people died. It was a big disaster for Nepal. So, Nepal faces economic losses year by year, every year. And the disaster loss is very high in terms of both death as well as the physical infrastructure destruction. And they are always constantly at risk. And the biggest problem that I see in future is that, we have invested so much of money in our hydropowers. And this year alone, we had so many hydropowers, medium-sized hydropowers, small-sized hydropowers, and like the Melamchi, that water supply scheme. So they are all damaged, and when you talk about these total loss of these disasters is going to be enormous. And earthquakes, they come once in a while, but then, they're so severe, and they can, paralyze us. They can just, bring us decades behind after these big earthquakes. So these are some of the things, just to show you, the summer monsoon. This is Nepal. Kathmandu is here, just, and so you have everything here in this Himalayan region. The why it happens, particularly hydrometeorological things, is, from the plains in Tarai, we call it the plains, then the Shivalik, the Mahabharata, the Midland, Fort Himalaya, and then you have this, the Tibetan area. So Nepal will lie from here to here. So you can see it from the plains to the high mountains, and even part of Tibet, Tibetan plateau, you can say, is in Nepal. So disaster is everywhere. And this Mahabharata range is, the first high mountain that you have when you come from the plains after the Shivaliks. This is a line which goes all the way through Nepal and also in India. And disaster-prone areas is here. The first cloud bursts and the big, the intense rain occurs here during the monsoon time, and disaster occurs here. So you have two places where these, this is from the plains to the Everest. You can see that there are two areas where, the concentration of rains are there, and they bring a lot of disaster, this hydrological. And you can see here, this is the Mahabharata range, what I showed you, and they'll look at the rains, this concentration of rains. So disasters occur not only here, of course, then here and there, you have a lot of other places for disasters. Earthquakes, you can see Nepal and the whole of Himalaya, in fact, right from Kashmir to, Assam and further east, we live in a highly sensitive zone for earthquakes. And the nightmare for us, we had 2015 earthquakes. It's okay. You had this earthquake, killed 10,000 people, and, a lot of damage and all that. But what next? And you see, Nepal is, and you have these two areas in the east as well as in the west. Kathmandu is here. And here you have, this is the recent work by Wilhelm, 2019. And you can see that the seismic gap here and seismic gap here, Sikkim and eastern Nepal and western part of, let's say, west of Gorkha or somewhere from Pokhara to far west, almost in India. It's a big gap. And the size of the earthquake here, 8.7 or even 8.5, 8.3, whatever you think of. And similarly in Sikkim, Bhutan area, you have 8.4, 8.5. It is something like 1934 earthquakes, or more than, bigger than 1934 earthquakes. So these seismic gaps are just ready to burst out, and then big earthquakes. So we are really concerned about these earthquakes. And you see, this is the estimate. It was done in 2005 by Wilhelm, and you see 274,000 deaths. Can you imagine? And this is Kathmandu Valley, and here we had this earthquake. And if it happens in the west, you see 230,000, 22,000. So just to give you the example, what we are expecting in the future in the Himalayan region. But these big earthquakes will even knock your doors in Delhi or in Patna or whatever, those areas. And you see in Nepal, the disasters going up from 2011 to 19. Well, you can go further down, but you see how they are going, the number of disasters. Similarly, the deaths, 400, 500, 900, 1,000 every year. And you can see floods, landslides, heavy rain, and, fire has become a very nuisance now in Nepal. A lot of fires are coming. And this is just this year alone, 2021, June to November, and still these cold waves are coming. And you can see the disaster is, almost 400 people have died, and 23,000 numbers of disasters. So, and I want to go to these all details of the statistics, I just wanted to focus more on these aspects of community-based disaster risk reduction in Nepal, CBDRR. I'm very happy that in recent time that there is a real paradigm shift in disaster risk reductions in Nepal. we struggled for nearly, you can say, from 80s, 90s, 2003, 3 decades. A lot of work has gone into that. And now we are very happy that we are beginning. We are coming to a new era of disaster risk reduction in Nepal. And that's what I just want to go a little bit more on that. You know, CBDRM was a kind of trademark for Nepal. Well, you know, it was a success story. And, you know, the whole decades of 90s, 2000, even early 80s, a lot of work was done. And we had a flurry of these activities everywhere. But, you know, gradually it waned out. And now, you know, it's not really, you know, catching up. And the question is now, how do we revive this wonderful idea of CBDRM? There's no alternative to it. Already, you know, highlighted, you know, by Timothy and also Amodji that, you know, this is the thing that we have to do ultimately. And now, if we don't go to this and revive it more strongly, disaster management cannot be successful. And as mentioned, and we know that, you know, disasters are now becoming part of our life more frequently than in the past. And more people are involved and more people are affected. So we have to have really a very, you know, robust system developed in future so that, you know, we minimize the loss of, you know, life as well as the property. And, you know, so that, you know, the development that we achieved so far will be, you know, protected. So otherwise, you know, what happens is you do something, after 10 years, 5 years, that's lost. And then you start from the beginning. That's what is happening in Nepal for many, many decades. Actually, we build road, and after 5 years, the road is not there. And then, you know, you start again from the scratch. We spent almost 25 years to complete this Kathmandu Valley water supply project, Melamchi project. And it was almost, actually we brought water into 27 kilometers of tunneling and all that. And then we brought the water even for testing, and then came this Melamchi. And then, you know, now we don't know when that project will be again, you know, come to life. So you can see that disasters are becoming more and more common. So what we did in this 2-3 years, we struggled. You know, we had an act on disaster-related act that was called Natural Calamity Act or Relief Act that was made in 1982. Thanks God, even we had that act, and many countries in the region didn't have even such kind of acts. We had, but it was only for the, you know, relief kind of work, how to go for relief, and some kind of, you know, things were there. But what we wanted is a comprehensive one, a new act replacing this one. And finally, we got Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act 2017. Of course, it took almost 10 years or 12 years after the first draft was submitted to the government from the private sector, the NGOs. And one of the NGOs that I represent here today was also responsible for that. Excuse me. Then we had this new political system came up, federal system, and we were successful even to include kind of, you know, disaster component in our constitution under 5.1 state policies. Here we say the state shall pursue the following policies. The state shall formulate and pursue a policy of designing a pre-warning system, disaster preparedness, rescue, relief works, and rehabilitation in order to minimize the risk of natural disaster. I think very few countries in the world may have such kind of statements in the constitution itself regarding this disaster management. Then, of course, during this period, you can see that all 17, 18, 17, 18, 17, 18. So we have now 10 of these documents prepared already. And now the question is, of course, we have the documents, but even documents are very important. We didn't have these documents before. So we have these strategies, we have the acts, we have guidelines, we have, policies, and a lot of other guidelines. And, we are now, in a way, well equipped with the legal, instruments to go for the disaster risk reduction in Nepal. Now, of course, this is not enough, and of course, we have to now work hard to make them work, implement those provisions in the field. That's the challenge now we have. But at least for the last 20, 30 years, our struggle has paid to some extent, and now these things are there. Yeah. Pardon? I didn't hear it properly.
That's a big achievement in Nepal that has taken place in the recent past. Yeah.
So, and we talk about early warnings. We talk about this CBDRM. We did a lot of work, but you know why it went out? It's no more activities. These were all, Nepal is economically, disadvantaged country. We lack resources. So a lot of international agencies, particularly INGOs, came up. And that was the time when, you had this IDNDR, and then IDDR came later on. So almost from 1991, I still remember, Amodji, this was you. I was the president at that time, if I remember correctly. You came and then said, oh, Professor Upredi, there is this IDNDR program has come from the UN, and now Nepal Geological Society should take up this and then do the work and like that. So Nepal Geological Society really started that the observation, or what you call this, the activities under the IDNDR. And Amaji, I still remember that you came up with all that. And then we almost 4 or 5 years, it was only Nepal Geological Society, which was really, acting on it. And then later on the government and then Home Ministry, and they started working on it. And now it's, and then of course we have another decade where these activities have come up. So all these UN agencies input, and also the trust on the natural disaster reduction, or the disaster reduction came up, and that helped. So a lot of UN agencies, INGOs, everyone was working in the CBDRM, and that was a big success. But then what happens? These are all projects, unless it is integrated into the system, as Amoji told, that unless you integrate into the system, it cannot go for a longer period of time. So that's what's happened. Now these INGOs are gone, or they have left these priorities, and so nothing is going on as such the way it was being done before. And also, we have also community things like this, but as Amoji also pointed out, we go with the high-tech things, we show them all that, a lot of work is being done. Of course, this research has to be done. But then, of course, we need, to go to the community, which can be, replicated by themselves. So that is the thing that we need to, so these researches are necessary, but, but then we need to go to that. Now, one more thing that...
Dr. Upredi, if I can request you.
I could not understand. Can you
said if I can request you to suggest the action points as others have suggested, that would be useful. So that we can move to...
Not very clear. Let me finish it and then I will come up. Is it okay?
Yes, I
not understand properly.
What I'm saying is, can you focus on the action areas, please?
Action areas.
Yes.
Okay. So here you have the DRR organizational framework in Nepal. This is what is being established now. I have no time to explain all these, but we have a framework now. And I wanted to just focus on this local disaster management committee, local government. Now, in our system of, the federal system, disaster management, disaster risk reduction, it's all now the total, in a way, fully mandated and they have made responsible to work on DRR at local level. This is something now our CBDRM will be strengthened now onwards if we are, if they are given all the resources necessary and supported more strongly. Now, they are the focal points. They are the focal organizations. So the previous one, CBDRM, which was a kind of, project works by INGOs and NGOs, now that's gone. Now here, if the INGOs, NGOs want to help, they will go to these local disaster management committees, but they have their own mandates now. They must work, they must give the priority, they must even allot the resources, mandatory resources are there. So this is what we think paradigm shift that I told in the beginning, that, next, if they are supported properly, I think we can have a really new system and very strong system of CBDRM. And of course, how our system works and your coordination mechanisms are all there. But this local disaster management committee and local governments are responsible for the disaster management, disaster risk reduction.
Pretty, if I can request you to conclude.
Now, this is my conclusion. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So these are some of the points that I have raised. I may not need to go more in details, but basically what I think is that mainstreaming of BRRM has to be done. Now it is already in the system is there. It has to be. Now we have also we call it IDD. We call it disaster risk. National IDD, how do we call it? Disaster management unit now we have in the government, which is now has a strong, presence, and that is going to help us. And at the same time, the system has been in place. We think that in the future, we will have a much better management system in Nepal and disaster management system in Nepal. Thank you so much. Sorry for little bit.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And we will come back to some of this, and the challenges of community in a high altitude country, the whole country is high altitude, and how do we deal about that? So thanks for bringing that up. We have last and most importantly, Dr. Aslam Parvez from ADPC here, and I would request him to succinctly tell us about both the journey of ADPC, of community-based disaster approaches, where people like AIDNR and Amodji and others have been involved for more than 25 years, but also what is the emerging future, because ADPC is at the forefront of the new approaches to CBD and future, such as, for example, application of social media technology, such as, for example, geospatial initiatives, etc. So, Aslam bhai, the floor is yours, and I look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mir bhai, and thank you, everybody. And first of all, Professor Neera and the team for organizing this. Everything has been said, so frankly speaking, I absolutely is speechless. That what should I say? I think the only thing I would say that in times we have to retrospect. In time, we have to introspect as well, that what exactly and where, in which timelines we are talking. We are preparing for the World Congress for Disaster Management 2021, perhaps the biggest, as per the advertisement that I see in the world. We are talking for a World Congress in a country where most of the things has changed the way we are actually looking at it, and particularly community. I will not put, and Mihir Bhai, I would not really repeat the journey of ADPC, otherwise it will just take me another 36 minutes for the 36 years. The only thing is about, and then of course, then I would override Manuji, Amodji and Krishnaji. They are my gurus with whom I have learned in different time. I just would want to highlight that in 2021, when in the last 25 years, if I am actually looking back, where I'm actually at in community engagement in disaster risk reduction and disaster resilience. So if that is allowed, I will put forward a couple of points, because for me, going back in perspective, going back to what really the paradigm shift which has not happened is actually the actions in anticipation for future. The paradigm shift has happened from a reactive to a preparedness bit, but what has not really has happened is how we really anticipate. So here in 2021, I mean, just a couple of weeks more to go to 2022, when I'm looking at it, I just give an example. I think 4th of October, the revised hazard information profiles, which has been released under the International Science Council and UNDRR. I would request all of us to go back and see. I mean, there are 302 hazards classified based on the earlier Sendai framework definition of all-hazard approach, or the intergovernmental working group which actually defined the disaster. If I look at that, I think perhaps one of the important things that I summarize is that when we are talking about flood, earthquake, and landslide in a particular geographical location, we should also talk about lightning. We should also talk about a typical disease within the community, which is quite prevalent. I will not name any of that. And this is exactly where I'm thinking that in 2021, the disaster and the understanding of hazard has changed. It has changed to us, and it has changed to the community as well. So the understanding of the community on hazard and its likelihood impact has changed. So I would not go back to the earlier concept of 1960s that for assessing the risk, we would only draw something on the piece of paper and do it. Right now, it is the time of Internet of Things. It is the time of technology. Most of the community that we are talking at this moment, even in the very far northern area of the high mountains, technology has reached. They are using mobile phones. The demonstration in Nepal, if I say, and the success, I mean, Amodji, you have yourself not only witnessed, you have lived and cherished all that one. I mean, let's remember that the knowledge that they actually gave it to you and set and us from post 2015, that how our houses should be built. It is not with the high-tech architect from outside or anybody from New Zealand coming us and teach. Those days has gone. In 2001 in Gujarat, perhaps we might be needing, what kind of technology, what kind of thing Patanka village would need, as Amodji you mentioned, or overall, in a Gujarati community, what kind of planning would be needed. Things has changed in 2021, and definitely it has changed for better. So counting on that one of the, I mean, and then of course, as Krishnaji already highlighted, that from reaching to the community to provide them relief, now we are actually facing a very typical situation. COVID is still not the global catastrophe. It is a catastrophe of a particular type. We haven't yet seen a situation, but what we really have seen in Nepal, in India, in overall Asia Pacific that we work, that a different type of emergencies, a different complex type of disasters has taken place. And that is actually compounding with the regular disaster. What the community need in this case is not really how to prepare for tomorrow, but how to prepare in anticipation of tomorrows. And with this, I think the most important thing Krishna ji already highlighted. Before the monsoon, our IMD in India, or I mean, I'm telling you in the number of whatever country that I have been working, we are very advanced. Our Maharashtra government, for example, 4 or 5 years ago, if I remember, in terms of estimating that how the drought would impact, and then number of initiatives which has been taken place, I think we should count on those. Then, combining with what we face in terms of this health pandemic, that is one. Early warning system is still very important, but we have also really gained a lot of advancement into that. But if we're really focusing on how this early warning can help community enhance their planning, you really have to focus on this forecast-based financing, because ultimately we have to give the community a certain amount of finances to protect them in anticipation. I mean, time and again in India particularly, I mean, today, since the discussion is in and around WCDM, I'm not trying to bring you examples from other countries which perhaps will not be very good here. I mean, in India itself, we really have advanced so much that our forecasting has become very important. And time and again, we have seen in Odisha and others in the news that, how the district governments has been effectively evacuating people in anticipation of various, known disasters, particularly cyclones and others. What is perhaps needed though now is to let the community read more messages on how they can plan for their alternate livelihood from an anticipation drought situation. So this is one. The minimum standards for community resilience has really changed. I would request you to read the latest document, which I think together with a large number of NGOs and GNDRR and UNICEF has actually brought. Those standards needs to be reviewed very particularly in 2021. And as we are now almost reaching to another targets of Sendai framework and with SDGs, the local level disaster risk reduction strategy is no more left with too much talk, but it is too much action. And I have seen myself in number of strategies that really has actionable program. I will just conclude here. I mean, since you mentioned about ADPC, I have been working here for 16 years, but prior to that, I tried learning from India and other place. When I came, every PowerPoint presentation of ADPC's CBDRR training used to start with the quote of our founder, Colonel Brandward, that the disaster that you are preparing is not the one that will happen. And today I will also repeat the same. I'm not Colonel Brandward. I'm his disciple perhaps, but it is the same, that the disaster that you are preparing for is not the one that will happen. And we must remember that one. So I will just end here. And sorry for my very less prepared talk. I am generally a prepared person, but I just landed after 32 hours traveling, Dubai and other places to here. So a bit of jet lag. So thank you, Meerbai. Thank you, Dr. Neera. And be assured that on ADPC's side, in the running of this WCDM and even later, if any resources, any information that is needed, we would be more than happy to provide. And it's really my privilege today with looking at Krishna ji and Amod ji and Upriti ji. You have set up the system. It is our time, and I perhaps looks like I'm the most youngest person here, even in my 50s. So we have the responsibility to take this into meaningful and in engaging community at what is needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aslam bhai. Thank you so much. Very succinct, though you say that it is already prepared, but very succinctly put together. Thank you very much. I'm instructed by the organizers that we don't have time for questions, so they've asked me to sum up, and that's a tragedy, a disaster of a time. But I think we benefited in balance by a very complete and full presentations by the eminent panel members that we had, and that's worth taking further ahead, because I'd like to sum up, and that's my role, as Meeraji has told me to, in a quick manner with five action points that I think we need to examine as far as community-based approaches and the new risks are concerned. One is the application, possible application, to what extent it's possible to have like basic income, basic relief for all. Is there a possibility, irrespective of disaster, country, whatever other variation, but some basic relief would be good, like basic income. And that's something, an area we can look at as far as community-based approaches is concerned. How do we do that locally? Second, I'm drawing from Krishna Vats's and is there something which is social protection, not during development, but during a disaster period for the communities? And is that something, an idea we can pilot somewhere? Then you may have suggestions about that. But I know at some places it is already done to an extent. So that's another area as far as CBD, the community disaster preparedness is concerned. Third, I'm drawing about risk transfer, that is insurance, which is after disaster, but beyond. So any disaster affected community may not anymore remain without insurance coverage immediately after the disaster and subsequently for years to come. So that's the fourth area. And the fifth area, Upratiji, I'm drawing from you, but connecting it with Tim's presentation, and that is that if we have the risk transfer, we also need mitigation funds. And can there be community-owned mitigation funds that we can prepare so that we not only pay for insurance, but we also mitigate and reduce the risk that causes the disasters to take place. And there is some work done on that. Krishna Vats's Indian Finance Commission has suggested 3 clear windows for that, and maybe some of the experience of that would be useful to read, not only national level, but community level, what could be done. And the last one, Aslam bhai, I'm drawing from you, and that is as far as the technology is concerned, I mean, how both the digital technology and geospatial technology, both access and use, but also ownership at community level. So does community own the data? Does community have access to data? Does community have access to maps and plans? Or it will still remain with somebody else higher up at the top? So with these words, I'd like to again thank you all of you very much for joining this important event. And I'm told by the technical people that had 68 participants, and we'll have a list of that subsequently. And the questions, I can only assure on behalf of myself, but perhaps Meeraji, if you allow, that once we receive them, we will allot them to definitely the panel members if they have time. Otherwise, Meeraji and I will draw from the work that you have presented and answer each question as best as we can. Thank you very much. I haven't thanked our Chakrabarti as well as Anand Babuji for the driving force behind the World Congress. And I thank them and their team and the scientific committee, which has made this particular thing possible. Thank you very much, and I hope to see all of you at the World Congress.